Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter is with me today. H, thanks for being here.
Autumn, thanks for having me back.
Well, we are going to talk about the election today, and we thought there are many themes that we could talk about, but we're going to select a few and talk about those. In the past week, since the election, I have been listening to and reading, probably much like many of our listeners, many reflections on the election results, many attempts at defining a narrative about what happened, and I learned something important. I learned that the proper way to start one of these discussions is for me to ask you how you're doing. And I was wondering if, you've been rejoicing, thinking the end of the world is forestalled, or have you just been like hand-wringing, walking around your house, going for a massage? So I think that's how we're supposed to start. Hunter is dying laughing.
It does not matter how I'm doing, and it doesn't matter what I'm feeling. And I, like you, have watched some election postmortem reflections, and man, a lot of people are really tuned into their feelings after this election.
Yep.
And I think the place to process that is in my quiet time with the Lord, and maybe with a couple of friends, not on a podcast. So it does not matter how I'm doing. And actually, that I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but it's true. It doesn't matter. But also, our listeners should know I find politics fascinating, but I'm not overly emotionally invested in the outcome. My experience over time has been that the world goes on, and that life goes on, and that we have challenges sometimes based on who's in office that God has providentially given us, but we can handle those. And so life goes on. I sometimes will point out, I was very emotional about politics when I was 13 years old. And I was a vociferous supporter of the first George Bush, campaigned hard for him, much to the chagrin of all my family who are kind of classic Southern Democrats. And angered my family, which was probably part of my intention as a 13-year-old, by becoming a Republican. And so my emotional political phase was my teenage years. And I still find politics fascinating. I read a ton about it. I find it very interesting and important to think about what's going on. But I'm not terribly emotionally up and down based on what the outcome of elections is. Mm.
All right. Well, maybe at some point in the future, there will be a different podcast episode in which we can tap into your emotional state. I also asked that question tongue in cheek because our hope on the podcast today is not at all actually to do that, to do an emotional sort of check-in. It is to examine a few of the cultural and political trends that we think are good for us to think about as Christians, and to come to well-reasoned positions on those, to know what to pray for, and to know how to engage well in our various places in the world.
We're recording this a little more than 1 week past the election results coming in, and I'm just sitting here thinking about how helpful it is to actually look at some of the cultural trends and what the election says about the direction of our culture. It's really helpful to do that even 8-9 days removed, as opposed to what I was thinking on election night and the day after. My thoughts are a little bit more informed and probably more coherent even just a week later. And there's something to be learned even in that.
All right, well, let's get to it. Let's talk about these themes that we identified. The first is legacy media versus new alternative media. What do we mean by that?
Legacy media is synonymous with what is sometimes called mainstream media. It's traditional news outlets. So we might think of, if we're thinking about television, we might think of CNN. We might think of the network news stations. Even more, we might think of like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, these kind of traditional media outlets. And by new alternative media, I primarily am thinking of podcasts, although I saw those being very influential in this election. We might also put Substack writers, that kind of thing, in new alternative media. And
Especially some of the long form podcasts.
that's right. Long form conversational podcast, even longer than the Vision for Life podcast. Sometimes our conversations get a little long winded, and yet
But they don't rival some of these other
they don't
podcasts.
rival some of these that are 2 to 3 hours
Nope.
long, like Joe Rogan, for example, which had a role in this election. But by legacy media versus new alternative media, I think we mean this. New alternative media is playing a bigger role in how people are processing what they think about the issues that are being discussed and about the candidates. And the legacy media is always reporting facts, but also turning those facts into narratives, stories. It's actually really important to think through the difference between facts and story. Facts is this is what happened. Story is this is the meaning that it takes. And you can actually become a great thinker if you'll just notice to differentiate between facts and story. Often we can agree on facts, or with some conversation we can come to a pretty common consensus about what actually happened. And yet the narrative that we want to make out of that can sometimes be very different. So the legacy media is not just reporting facts. They're also making narratives. This happens even with your favorite football team. What does the fact that they got blown out last week mean? What does that mean for the direction they're headed? It's not just that they lost the game 63-21, but what does that mean for the coach's future? What does that mean it's going on internally? So now we just take the same thing and apply it to politics. The legacy media is always coming up with narratives. That's their job. That's what media and newspapers have done forever. And many of their narratives are not as trusted anymore. And people are more and more turning to alternative news sources or alternative media to make sense out of what's going on. So we're seeing that in this election. The narrative that the mainstream media put on the election, particularly about President Trump, was challenged by some alternative media sources like podcast, and it appears that a lot of people are not buying into the mainstream media narrative. There's also an example of some of the candidates and the public actors are more comfortable with new media, and some are more comfortable with the legacy media. So the legacy media tends to editorially skew to the left, and people on that end of the spectrum are pretty comfortable with it. And Kamala Harris was a great example of a candidate who was very comfortable in the world of legacy media. She did well when she had an interviewer from that kind of stream of things. She did well with scripted events that are framed up to be broadcast and absorbed by legacy media and turned into stories. She did really well with that. Donald Trump is pretty good with that at knowing how to work that legacy media too, but he's also very comfortable with these new alternative media forms. Most famously in this election, he went on the Joe Rogan podcast very late in the election cycle and had a wide-ranging, I actually haven't listened to it, but I've heard it's a wide-ranging conversation. I listen to a new media podcast on a weekly basis called the All In Podcast, and it is a conversation between 4 Silicon Valley investors who are like wealthy Silicon Valley investors, have a long history in Silicon Valley, and they actually have different political perspectives. But 2 of them this year became supporters of President Trump. One of them even hosted a big fundraiser at his super luxe San Francisco mansion for President Trump. And then President Trump came on their podcast and they talked to him for a couple of hours. And his comfort with just discussing issues and discussing American culture for 2 hours, just kind of off the cuff with whatever these guys wanted to talk about, was noticeable. Whether you agreed or disagreed or liked or didn't like what he said, he was comfortable doing that. They invited Kamala Harris on, and she did not come. She famously didn't go on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I'm not sure she would have done well if she had done that. I'm not sure she has the ability to sit for 3 hours and just kind of have a wide-ranging conversation. So it's interesting to ask, how does our politicians' comfort or discomfort with that fit? If I'm thinking back to my boyhood, Bill Clinton was famously wonky, and on the Democratic side of things. I have no doubt Bill Clinton could have sat and talked for 3 hours with Joe Rogan about whatever he wanted to talk about. So this is something we should watch.
Yeah. I think this is a fascinating revelation that has come out of this election, the election results. I mean, these forms of alternative media have been on the rise for a while now, for a few years. But the way that they were used in this election is fascinating. There are a few other publications that I think we could add to that list, like the Free Press, Unheard, which have both
Barry Weiss,
Barry
Honestly
Weiss
podcast.
Yes.
And she does the Free Press. Is that right?
Yes, she started the Free Press. Yeah. And so both Unheard and the Free Press have podcasts that they run and produce and print pieces that they run and their publications are, I think, gaining ground and gaining subscribers. I listened to a conversation on one podcast that I really love. It's called Freakonomics, between Stephen Dubner, the host, and Fareed Zakaria. And Zakaria was pointing out this exact fact. And he made some of the same observations that you just shared about the way that Trump appeared on some of these podcasts and was much more comfortable in these alternative forms of media, particularly long form versions of these podcasts and such, and made the same comparison that you did about Kamala Harris wasn't as comfortable in those formats. And he pointed out something that was interesting. There was a moment during the campaign when Donald Trump started to just play his Spotify playlist. And so Zakaria...
He played it for a long time and he danced.
A long time.
It was very awkward.
It was very awkward. But Zakaria actually pointed to that as a good differentiator between the two. And he said, the legacy media spun that as strange.
This guy's off the rails. He's unhinged.
Yeah, this guy is unhinged. And he said, but some people loved it because he said it was pointing out they interpreted it like he was tired, he was bored, and said, guys, let's just take a break and listen to some music. And so that actually reveals some of this desire for authenticity, getting a sense of a person. And so it depends on where you look as to what the meaning made out of that is.
It really does give you a sense of the person when you sit and talk with them for a long time. So I think in our authenticity culture, where that carries so much currency, it's valuable to be able to do that. I also think it reveals a hunger for people to be able to discuss issues in a way that's not canned and it's not soundbitey. So one thing that happens on these podcasts is the conversation can go back and forth. And on the best ones, there's some pushback, there's some tough questions, but what about this? And we can talk about these things in a more substantial way. And I think people are hungry for that. You might even think of the difference between those podcast conversations and the presidential debates. The presidential debates are very tightly bound. The time limits are tightly bound. The interviewers ask questions. The candidates try to respond with sound bites that will later translate to the nightly news and to social media. And so it's kind of a legacy media event that is meant to be done in sound bites. This is revealing a hunger for something completely different. I have a friend who has been a longtime political stager for people on the Democratic side, and he worked on the Harris campaign. And his whole job is to go stage public events in a way that they'll look great on TV and to figure out how the sound bites will translate. And I think people are wise to that, and they're saying we want to discuss these things in a less scripted and more substantive way.
All right. Let's move on to theme number 2. So the second theme we wanted to discuss is that the voting coalition that emerged from this presidential election was fascinating and represented a significant shift. So we want to ask, what does the Trump voting coalition actually mean?
A friend from Europe texted me the night after the election and said, What do you make of this election?" And I texted him back my quick back of the napkin analysis of Trump's voting coalition, and then I never heard back from him. So I take it that that he didn't like my answer. But coalitions are a group of people with different interests, and in order to elect a candidate, especially a presidential candidate, it takes people from different interests and persuasions all coming together in order to form that 50+% that would elect a candidate. And what that means is the quote swing voters. This is why you hear so much about the swing voters. The swing voters are the ones who are persuadable, and they might go one way or they might go the other, and they become part of the coalition that elects a candidate. And I think it's interesting that in this 2024 election, if you compare it to the voting coalition Trump got in 2016, it's a different coalition. And the 2024 coalition, by all statistical measures, now we're talking facts, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking facts. Factually, it's a broader coalition. He grew his support among groups of people that didn't support him in 2016 and probably didn't support him in 2020 either. So, for example, he grew his support among Latinos. That doesn't necessarily mean he became the majority candidate among Latinos, but He got enough of the Latino vote to carry states. And in this case, he got built a big enough coalition to win the popular vote, which he had not done in his previous two elections. Now we get into story. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. That's the facts. What sense do you make of it? And I think what we're just pointing out here is there's going to be a lot of analysis being done by people trying to explain what that means. And I don't know that we know exactly what it means, but we're just pointing out that's a live debate.
Mm-hmm. This particular revelation that came out of this election, this coalition that voted for Trump, I think personally, as I've listened to the news reports and reflections and podcasts and read articles, this is one of the most interesting aspects of this because it does represent a shift, especially among certain demographic groups, and a realignment. Some of the narratives about the divisions between race and between gender didn't hold up in the election results. There is a professor at Stony Brook University who has a Substack. His name is Musa Al-Garbi. He's a sociologist. And in one of his reflections on the election, he wrote this: "The rise of populism, tensions over identity politics, and the crisis of expertise are all facets of a deeper struggle between knowledge economy professionals and the growing number of Americans who feel alienated from the social order we, those professionals," so he's talking about this knowledge class of professionals, preside over. And so even though this is a live debate, it does seem that there was some interesting resorting that is more along class lines than along racial lines or along gender lines that came out of this election. More than pollsters predicted, even though the polls were fairly accurate, it was going to be a tight race. But more than was predicted in the months leading up to the election. And so I think it is interesting that Trump gained a lot of ground among the working class and particularly among working class minorities. And so we'll see how this theme develops. We can't quite, as you said, draw exact conclusions about it yet, but the data is interesting.
There was a book that came out, I think it was last year, by Michael Lind called The New Class War, that also has an analysis of what's going on in American culture. It sounds like very similar to Musa Al-Garbi in what he's describing here. So this is something we should be paying attention to as Christians. Perhaps American culture is starting to be polarized more by things like education and socioeconomic status than it is by things like race or even geography. So we should pay attention to that. You also, in our notes that we kind of compiled before the show, you collected some of the narratives you heard being spun out there or being offered.
Yes,
Offered or spun.
both.
Yeah.
Both, as people attempt to make meaning out of this.
I want to read these for our listeners, and I want to read them as a way of saying, pay attention when people are making meaning out of facts. Pay attention to the narratives and ask yourself, is that a fair or is that an accurate narrative that they're making? And just be aware that they're making a narrative. Like, don't assume that you have to buy every one of these narratives, but some of them may have value in it. So here's some narratives Autumn has heard in the last week. The general pattern of our political movement is not movement to the right or left, but rather a pattern of anti-incumbency. Biden should not have run at all. The time available after he pulled out of the race to the election was not sufficient to hold a primary. His administration was broadly unpopular, and Kamala was unable to separate herself from Biden. Kamala was a weak candidate. The country is full, at least half full, of people who are racist, sexist, transphobic, or all of the above. Hate and fear won. The people want a strongman presidential figure, and Trump represents their hopes. It all comes down to the economy and immigration. The Democratic Party's pandering to the leftist identity politics shrunk its tent and limited its cultural reach. These are all a bunch of narratives that are offered, and I think it's good to just be wise to it out there. And I want to say, especially be wise to narratives that are made about Christians, because almost always when someone's offering a narrative, they have a reason why they want that narrative to be true. Even if it's a negative narrative about a group of people, they want it to be true for some reason. Or it explains their own feelings and gut intuition. So be aware of the narratives that are offered and look at them discerningly and discriminatingly.
That's a really good word, Hunter. In every one of these scenarios that are floated, there is some evidence. Usually someone who is promoting a certain narrative can point to something to prop that up. And the truth is almost always the facts and that point us in the direction of meaning are almost always more complex. So for some people, for a handful of voters, the way that they decided might come down to one of these narratives, but that would be very few. For most people, it's a combination of factors that helped them reach their ultimate decision as to how they were going to vote in this election. And I think coming out of the election, that's still true for them.
That's right. And these narratives can change quickly. It'll be fascinating to watch how durable this voting coalition that elected Trump is after Trump is off the scene and we know he's not able to run again. So will another Republican candidate, even someone from the MAGA movement who represents that movement, will they be able to hold this voting coalition together in 2028? That remains to be seen. Obama had a pretty broad voting coalition when he won, and that coalition did not prove to be very durable for Democrats beyond him. And what that means is then the narratives that we start to spin change pretty rapidly in 8 years. And so as we're looking at these narratives and at these coalitions, we need to realize how momentary they sometimes are and keep our minds open as to what happens next.
Yeah. I mentioned a conversation earlier that I listened to on Freakonomics in which Fareed Zakaria pointed out, interestingly, that both Obama and Trump are in different ways anti-establishment candidates and were able to pull together a coalition that crossed these lines that gave them enough of the vote and enough support to win election. You pointed out something else interesting, Hunter, that I want you to comment on before we move past this. And that is the question, you've brought it up in a way already. How should we think about this as Christians? But particularly in terms of the coalition that did elect Trump this time around. Because in 2016, he had to appeal more directly to evangelicals to give him enough of the vote to win. And now in this re-election cycle, in that we just went through, he didn't need to appeal to this group of evangelicals who were supporting him in quite the same way. He had amassed enough support in from other groups to make up for that. And so we saw him soften his stance in certain ways or use different language, adopt different positions than he did in 2016. And so my question is, what are your observations right now about what that means for evangelicals within that voting coalition, or perhaps in governmental positions, who supported Trump this time around? What does it mean for them?
Evangelicals, and particularly white evangelicals, are part of a bigger group of people you might call social conservatives. And social conservatives are those who tend to uphold traditional morality, traditional social positions based in the Judeo-Christian ethic. And that not only do they uphold those in their personal life, but it tends to drive a lot of their political activity and their voting as well. So social conservatives would also include many Roman Catholics, many conservative Roman Catholics. So it's not just evangelical Protestants, but it's also Roman Catholics. And it's also some people who might be culturally Christian, but they're not practicing members of any particular local church. In fact, some studies have shown that the term, quote, white evangelicals often includes people who say they're Christian or they say they're evangelical in a survey, but they don't actually, participate in a church. So this is a part of a group of people that we might call social conservatives, of whom evangelicals are a subset of that. And social conservatives have been part of the Republican voting coalition at least since the 1980s, at least since the Reagan years. And they're still part of the Republican voting coalition. The majority of them are anyway. But they're a smaller part of the coalition proportional to other people and other members of the coalition. So what does that mean for them? I think that means they're going to have probably less power within the coalition itself. One of the ways that just manifest is in 2016, Trump really needed to win that part of the coalition. It was obvious that part of the coalition he was not their favorite candidate. He was not the one that they wanted. You heard many in that stream saying, well, Trump is not the candidate we want. Will we vote? And kind of openly questioning, will we vote for him just based on policy, even though we have a lot of reservations about his character? Now, there were some in that coalition who, talked almost messianically about Trump. They're pretty fringy, but many were just kind of wrestling with this. And a few prominent voices said, we absolutely cannot in any circumstance vote for Trump. And then many of them were more open-minded about voting for him, but not enthusiastic about it. And Trump selected Mike Pence as his vice presidential candidate, largely to appeal to that constituency because Mike Pence represents that part of the coalition. In this election, he didn't need that person. He didn't need that kind of vice presidential candidate. He did not need to appeal as strongly to that part of the coalition. Abortion is always been an issue that activates that part of the voting coalition. And Trump basically said in this election cycle, I did my part on abortion with getting Supreme Court justices appointed and overturn Roe v. Wade. It's now a state's issue. I'm kind of done. That's what he said. He didn't really offer them much more on abortion. He did offer them things on all the stuff that's happening around transgender and gender identity. He did offer them some, and I think that was a salient issue and a issue that rallied a lot of people to vote. But it doesn't appear that this is as big a part of the current Trump voting coalition as it has been historically. And I think that's going to be fascinating to watch. It'll have some implications for how social conservatives have to engage politics moving forward.
Thanks for reflecting on that. I do think that is an interesting dynamic to watch, to ask how will Christians engage politics, especially Christians who are part of that voting bloc, that voting coalition, when they can't rely as much on having power within the party within the Republican coalition. All right, let's move on to the next theme that we wanted to discuss, which is the way that abortion factored in this election cycle. With Roe v. Wade being overturned, the question of abortion did go back to the states, so it became more of a local issue, and it was represented in many places, on the ballot in many places around the country, and was something that different politicians, both at the presidential level and down ballot, campaigned on. So our third theme, the thing we wanted to talk about, is abortion becoming a local issue.
That's right. There's facts on the ground about how people are voting as it pertains to abortion. And what we're saying is those facts seem to point to this story. Abortion is becoming more and more of a local issue, which means how you engage it as a Christian is probably going to depend on where you are, what the political and legal environment is in the place where you live. Now, let's maybe back up and try to support that with a few facts. President Trump said when he ran, we've already mentioned this, he basically said, hey, I got Roe v. Wade overturned. He took credit for that. And now it's a state's issue, and that's where it belongs. It belongs at the state's issue. Democrats tried to use abortion as an issue to rally their voters and to say, Trump is going to issue more abortion bans. And he would, in debates, in his rallies, he would flatly deny that. He would go back and go, that's not true. I'm not trying to issue more abortion bans. It's now a state's issue. I'm kind of done on this, effectively, is what he was saying. And it doesn't appear that Democrats were able to use that issue to really rally voters. One of the ways that shows up is in some states, there were abortion measures either to have restrictions or to loosen restrictions on their ballots. There were abortion measures on those ballots. And many of the states that voted to weaken abortion restrictions also voted for President Trump, which means some of the people who voted for President Trump also voted to weaken abortion restrictions. So voters were able to pick through this, and I think voters are starting to see where the action is on this issue is really in the state in which I live. So what I want to now say to Christians like myself who care very much about this from a pro-life angle is I need to now be thinking more and more locally, or more and more about what's the facts on the ground here in Colorado where I live. Mm-hmm. There is still possibility that there could be national abortion legislation. The Republicans have a majority in both the House and Senate, and they've got the presidency. If the part of the Republican coalition that cares about this is able to rally that, they could advocate for some kind of national abortion legislation that might restrict it, at a certain point. But it doesn't appear that President Trump has a big appetite for that, and I'm very skeptical that President Trump is going to support national abortion legislation just based on what he's said. And so it appears that for Christians who want to think about how do we advocate for life and how do we protect unborn life in our culture, we need to be asking what the facts on the ground are where we live.
Mm-hmm. So depending on where you live, it might be possible, given the state of your state or local politics, mostly this is at a state level, your state politics, to advocate and work for abortion restrictions. In other places, like where we are, in Colorado, it's becoming less possible to restrict that in any legal or formal sense. So when you say this is becoming a more of a local issue and that we should be mindful of what the reality on the ground is in our state, so in this election cycle, Colorado voters voted to enshrine the right to an abortion into constitutional law in Colorado. And the major change that was made in the legislation that was passed that changed abortion rights in Colorado from what it had been previously, so under Roe v. Wade, was the fact that publicly funded abortions can now be made available through state healthcare systems, and that some private insurers can now offer coverage for abortion in their policies. The law doesn't state that they have to, that private insurers have to, but they can make that available as a part of their healthcare policy. So for us living in the state of Colorado, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, to enshrine abortion as a constitutional right, I feel obligated to say this. That is a travesty of both logic and morality. It's when we talk about rights, we should be talking about something that's rooted in something deeper than our current prevailing opinion. So historically, human rights are rooted in the fact that we are created by God, and they are rooted in the order of nature that God made. And so this is true like in our own American history. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. So then we should ask, is abortion a right that God has given to us? Is an abortion a right that He's woven into the fabric of creation? And it's not a right that God has given to us. In fact, it's an action that undoes the fabric of the creation that God gave us. So to endow it as a right in any constitution is a travesty. And we ought to say that as Christians. And I would say even to people who I would strongly disagree with them on this, but even I'm sure some of our listeners might say, well, I think abortion should be, there should be legal abortion in some ways, even if you think that, to call it a right is wrong. To call it a right just means that you haven't thought well about what a right is. And so even those who want abortion to be legal, I would challenge you, in what way should it be legal? I don't think it should ever be legal as a constitutional right. Perhaps it should be legal as a statutory law. Maybe you could make that argument. But to call it a right is just brain dead. So we have to say that. Now, that doesn't change the fact that it's now a constitutional right in Colorado where I live. And that has real consequences for what we can do legally to restrict abortion. And that means that you can't just pass a state law that would some way restrict abortion because the Constitution supersedes the statutory law. And practically on the ground for Christians, I think that means that being pro-life and working to protect unborn life is going to look more like advocacy, persuasion, and coming alongside expecting mothers and making it possible for them to choose life for their children. Christians have done a good job of this under kind of the Roe v. Wade, legal administration. They advocated for legal reform, but they also did things like crisis pregnancy centers. And crisis pregnancy centers are helping expecting mothers, many of whom were not expecting to be pregnant. It's helping them to choose well. They did things like, and have done things like, adopting children and being available for adoption. This makes it far more likely that a mother who doesn't want to have an abortion doesn't feel like she has no other options. And so even if we're really concerned, like I am, that we would call this a constitutional right, I still think if I'm asking now what do I do with this situation we're in here in Colorado, I think we've got to get busy on the ground, loving working mothers and expecting mothers and helping them to choose life.
In some ways, the state that we find ourselves in now is one that the church has been in before. And I think of the comparison to the early church, the first century church, and in the first few centuries of the church's existence, the culture that the church came to be in, grew up in, under the leadership of the apostles, and then shortly after, was one in which the social perspectives, the cultural value placed on children was very different, and infanticide was widely practiced. And one of the ways that the church began to have cultural influence was by taking a unique perspective that was very countercultural on the lives of infants, babies, and children, and there was clear teaching about it. It's even addressed in the Didache, which is a collection of the earliest teachings of the apostles that's non-canonical. And so the church has existed in a sort of culture before in which the lives of children, and particularly infants and babies, were systematically devalued. And the church's response was not to be aligned with that cultural persuasion, but was to instead see, as you just described a moment ago, Hunter, the value of life because of the Imago Dei, because we're created in the image of God, and because of the distinct ways that Jesus talked about children and about women and children in his ministry, and the unique teaching that existed in the early church. And so I think what you're saying, we can live as the church in that way, in a way that still consistently values life, by coming alongside expectant mothers, by supporting the lives of unborn babies in the ways that we can, and by calling men and women together to a vision for family and shared life and responsibility about the lives of children that is countercultural.
And I'm glad you just put men on the hook for that too. So much of this focuses on women and their choices, but part of the social structure that allows abortion to continue and to be the option that many women think they have to choose is the way men behave. And so part of our holistic approach to being those who advocate for life is also to call men to the nobility of fatherhood and of being husbands and providers for their homes. So thanks for adding that into the conversation.
All right, let's move on to theme number 4, which is this election is seeing a return to political norms. And you say, H, that's good for our larger body politic, and we should be thankful. Ooh, now you're veering into maybe telling people how they should be in their emotions just a little bit.
Thanks for throwing me under the bus there. I always look at elections and look at politics and ask, how is what's happening affecting the whole, quote, body politic, which is the whole environment or the whole culture, the whole political climate and culture. And I think that was one of the things that was so concerning about what President Trump did after the 2020 election, when it was obvious that he had exhausted all the legal challenges and that everything that needed to be recounted had been recounted and everything that needed to be examined had been examined. And these are the results. It was pretty clear. Those are the results, and these results are reliable, including like Republican Secretary of State in Georgia is like, this is reliable, and he still continued to question the results. And then we had the riot on January 6th. It was concerning to me what this is doing to our body politic. And it appeared that the norms that have really helped us be a stable democracy were now starting to be violated. So famously, President Trump did not attend the inauguration of President Biden. There just wasn't a normal transition of power, and that was very concerning. So one of the things that I've been reassured by, in fact, if you're right, if there's one thing I've been emotional about in this, it has been the normalcy. And I actually started to see signs of it before the election itself. For example, I thought the Republican primary and convention process was very normal. It was a primary. They had a primary. There were some challengers to President Trump. There were some alternatives on offer. None of them could get any traction except for one. And Nikki Haley seemed to represent a desire of some to kind of go a different direction. But in the end, President Trump prevailed. And then a very normal thing happened, and that is that most Republicans, including Nikki Haley, they threw their hat in support of him. And that's how political parties work in their primary process. There's usually a challenge, there's an open debate, these candidates disagree, and then when there's a winner, they all rally and support the winner, and they act like this was the perfect thing all along. That's normal.
Okay, I'm going to call time out for a moment, though. I agree with what you've said, but there were some odd things in this election cycle.
A lot of odd things.
Like the way that the debate occurred between President Biden and Trump. And that Biden performed very poorly. There was sort of a national level reckoning after that. That was unusual, not normal. And then Biden deciding to, or being pressured to, step aside. The way that Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee was perhaps understandable in some ways, but not normal. She ran a short campaign. And then there were a couple of attempted assassination attempts on President Trump. And so none of those things kind of fit within this category.
Yeah, well, one of them was an assassination attempt and one was an attempted assassination attempt. So let's differentiate those.
All right.
Yes, maybe a better way to say it is there was so much strange stuff that it would be easy to lose sight of what actually was normal. And what I'm just wanting to point out is, yep, all that strange stuff happened. It was weird, and it was odd. I mean, especially what happened on the Democrat side was like so out of the ordinary. But there were some signs of return to normalcy, and I started to see it going back to the Republican convention when they had a very normal convention, and they just kind of rallied to their winner, and they brought the different factions of the party, the different constituencies, they brought them together to support their nominee. And traditional Republicans who aren't really MAGA Republicans have figured out how to exist in Trump's world. And that is what normal politicians do. They when someone gets power, the rest of them figure out how to exist in that world. I had a lot of friends who worked in the Clinton administration, and several of them came and stayed with me when Obama got nominated in 2008 here in Denver, and they were all just Clinton people trying to figure out how to exist in the new Obama world. And it was fascinating to watch those two camps try to figure out how to coexist. It was a big intra-party thing, but you wouldn't know that if you just watched what was happening on TV, because everyone said, this is wonderful. We all support Barack Obama. That's what normal politicians do. The Republicans did that this time. Okay. Then, after the election, Kamala Harris calls President Trump and she concedes the election. Mm-hmm. She offers a very gracious concession speech. Mm-hmm. It's a classic concession speech that says, I concede the election and our fight's not over. That's normal political concession speech. President Trump actually gave a very normal victory speech. It was, President Trump's speeches sometimes they can be very incendiary. They can be very dark at times, or he can just start playing his iTunes playlist. As you referenced earlier.
You don't quite know.
And then sometimes he can make a normal speech. His convention speech was part normal, part dark. It was like it starts normal and then he goes off script and it turns dark. Like he can go back and forth between those things in a way that can be pretty unsettling. Mm-hmm. But he gave a very normal acceptance speech on election night. He actually acknowledged that God had spared his life, and he says he wants to be a president for all Americans. His behavior post-election night has been fairly normal for an incoming president-elect. He's made a couple of flamboyant and provocative cabinet picks.
Yeah.
But he's
provocative / concerning.
Yeah, / might not pass the Senate. Who knows?
Yeah.
But it's been a fairly normal transition of power. Just yesterday, as we're recording this, President Biden hosted him in the Oval Office for the traditional meeting between the winner and the outgoing president, and he President Trump thanked President Biden for helping to ensure a smooth transition. So there's some normalcy that's returning to our political system. I actually think a lot of that could also have to do with the fact that we're not in the pandemic anymore, and so we're not living in the weird cultural and political environment that was 2020 in the pandemic. But there's a lot of normalcy returning, and I think we should just pray that that continues. And I want to commend and thank particularly Vice President Harris, the way she conceded. I think former Presidents Clinton and Obama both issued statements acknowledging Trump as the winner that I think helped this process. I think President Biden is acting commendably in this. So I really want to thank them, and I think we should be thankful for what they're doing to bring normalcy. And we should also acknowledge where President Trump has showed some normal victory behavior, and I think we should just encourage that and pray that it continues.
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, when we were talking about various narratives that are being surfaced about meaning making out of this election, you warned against any kind of totalizing narrative. And I think that's good to adhere to here also. We should listen to pundits with a degree of wariness and exercise discernment when they're telling us that democracy is going away or that this will be the last election. We should just be sober-minded about totalizing narratives in either direction.
That's a good word. A lot of the Save America rhetoric suggests that if certain people are in power, we're going to lose America. And we've seen that on both sides. There was a narrative out there that we're not going to even have elections anymore if President Trump wins. I seriously doubt that's the case. There was a narrative out there, he is a fascist, and this is the rise of Hitler. Now, as we've discussed on previous episodes of the podcast, I'm actually reading a biography of Winston Churchill right now that covers the period of time in which Hitler is rising in Nazi Germany, and Winston Churchill is trying to warn everyone. And what was happening in Germany at that period of time is completely different than what's happening in America right now. There is very little danger that Trump is going to turn into Hitler. That took Hitler gaining control of the whole German society, except for just, very disparate voices who were trying to oppose him. He had to gain control of all the media. He had to gain control of the complete electorate. And there is a viable opposition, a healthy, viable opposition to Donald Trump in American life, in the media, in 50% of the almost 50% of the electorate, in the Democratic Party. That all of that keeps a single person from gaining totalitarian power in the United States, and we're not anywhere close to that. So when I heard that narrative being offered, I thought, man, you can really not like President Trump, and you can be concerned about what he injects into the body politic with some of his behavior and some of his language and words. But you can be concerned about that and not think he's Hitler. And that's a silly narrative. And so we need to be careful about these totalizing narratives. I guess we're returning to that theme again. I think what the facts on the ground are showing is that democracy in America is fairly healthy and durable, and there's people who are acting wisely and are doing normal democratic things. And so this is just what it is normally like to live in America.
And you said there's a healthy opposition. We see that in the numbers coming out of this election. It was, as predicted, close. So even though Trump won and won clearly in terms of the election results, there's a large number of people. This Democratic voting bloc that exists in America is still also large. And so I think we see that borne out in the data coming out of this election as well. All right. Well, we could go on talking and identify more themes. But I think we should wrap it up so that we're not trying to rival Joe Rogan in terms of length of podcast. So I do want to ask, though, where does this leave us? Because that is often how we close on the Vision for Life podcast. We want to ask, how do we, while adhering to a biblical worldview, desiring to love God and live righteously, love our neighbors well, how do we do that? In light of everything that we're discussing, that's what we want to ask on the Vision for Life podcast. And so I want to close by reading an excerpt from one of the articles that you and I read. It's published in Mere Orthodoxy, written by Jake Meador, and the title of this article, which we will link to, I'm not going to take lengths to explain. The title is a little funny. It's called The Doug Election and America After the Great Dechurching.
But it's a tie-in to a great Saturday Night Live skit that everyone should go and watch.
To an SNL skit that is excellent. So check out the article, watch the skit, but I'm going to read an excerpt from that article by Jake Meador to close us out today. He asks, so what comes next for American Protestants? And Meador observes, I suspect there are three dominant theopolitical tribes within evangelicalism at the moment. First, there is the firmly Trump-aligned evangelicals who are essentially the evangelical version of the Daily Wire. Second, there is the vociferously never-Trump block of evangelicals, which is basically the evangelical version of the Bulwark. And he goes on to comment, both of these groups have the same problem. There isn't actually a need for evangelical Daily Wire because the Daily Wire already exists. The same applies to the Bulwark, even if in slightly more complex ways. So that brings him to where we want to land today as well. Jake Meador says, I think the third block of evangelicals is a group that voted in a broad variety of ways, but isn't particularly obsessed with politics because they're busy volunteering around their community, helping out in the nursery at church, amen, and taking care of their families. They're not interested in revolutionary political ideologies of any type, but neither are they triggered when a friend expresses a political opinion they disagree with. They care about politics, but it isn't what moves or excites them most. What excites them are the things that have always excited God's people. Hearing the gospel preached, seeing people repent and enter into the church and grow in grace, seeing new ministries and works established, and finding ways of putting their skills and ambitions to work in service to God and neighbor. And then finally, he says, one product of the angst and anxiety and social isolation is the emergence of political religions. If we allow ourselves to get sucked into that, then we don't actually have anything to offer our neighbors because we will be no different. We will simply be defined by the same anger and anxiety as them. On the other hand, if we can be communally engaged, not easily triggered by the choices and beliefs of neighbors, and genuinely present ourselves as a place of welcome and hospitality, then I think the potential in our moment for the gospel is quite exciting. I think that's a good word for us to conclude with today.
Hit the music, Jesse.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.